Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Dystrup-Chang. I've been with Amazon a bit over 9 years, currently leading a product and engineering organization within the Amazon grocery business. Prior to that, I spent a few years helping lead Amazon's integration with Whole Foods and running the Whole Foods grocery delivery business. During that time, I worked closely with John and lots of people throughout Whole Foods. And so I'm delighted to have the opportunity to connect with John today to discuss his new book and to hear him share his thoughts about conscious leadership. And so with that, I'd love to introduce John. As many of you know, John is the CEO and co-founder of Whole Foods Market. He's also the co-founder of Conscious Capitalism and the co-author of Conscious Capitalism. He has devoted his life to selling natural and organic food and building a better business model. This month actually marks the 40th anniversary of the opening of the first Whole Foods Market store in Austin. So congratulations to John and the entire Whole Foods Market team. John's latest book is called Conscious Leadership, and it delves into 9 distinguishing characteristics and behaviors that unite conscious leaders through vision, mindset, and culture. And today we're going to be discussing some of that with John. Conscious Leadership will be released on September 15th, and so we are lucky to get a preview of that book today with John. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Heather. Good to be here.
Maybe before we get into a discussion about your new book, I thought it might be helpful just for some context to hear a bit more about Conscious Capitalism, which is the book that you first published in 2013. You've also started the Conscious Capitalism movement. And so for those who are listening who might not be familiar with the work, I thought it'd be helpful if you could provide a bit of context and background on it.
Well, sure. They obviously wrote a book on it, so I can't summarize it in a few sentences, but I'll do the best I can. Conscious capitalism is capitalism, but it's done more consciously. And we recognize in the book that there are basically 4 pillars for which conscious capitalism sits on top of. The first one is the potential for higher purpose, that every business has the potential for a higher purpose besides just trying to maximize profits. Number 2, that all the stakeholders matter, not just the shareholders. So customers, employees, suppliers, investors, communities, they're all the major stakeholders that are voluntarily exchanging with the business. And the purpose of business, or one of the purposes of business, is to create value for all of them simultaneously. So that's the second pillar. The third pillar is conscious leadership, which is what the new book is based on. And conscious leadership is well, we've got a whole book on it, but it's mostly doing business in a more conscious way in terms of the way you relate to your team members, to your employees, and how you connect with them. And then culture is what the organization creates. So Whole Foods has a unique corporate culture. Amazon has a corporate culture. And there's overlap between those two cultures, and there are also differences. And a conscious culture is one where you're trying to make it a culture where people flourish, where people are happy, where people commit to the company and are really enjoying their work and learning and growing and live happily ever after. That's a conscious culture. So those 4 make up conscious capitalism.
Great, and that's a good segue into my next question, which was, how did you decide to write a whole book on conscious leadership?
After we wrote Conscious Capitalism, which was published in 2013, I do a lot of public speaking, and on Conscious Capitalism, we have a nonprofit organization, consciouscapitalism.org, which people can look into. We have conferences, CEO summits, and the questions I got most often were about leadership. People said those were their favorite chapters in the book, and we had 2 of the chapters in that book were on leadership, conscious leadership. And they wanted a lot more, because talking about conscious capitalism is one thing, but how do you do it? How do you actually do it in the real world? And while we gave hints of it, I realized we needed to go a lot deeper. And so that's what conscious leadership does. It's in some ways I also wrote it because I don't know how, I mean, I'm getting older, and part of what I want to leave behind is my leadership philosophy for future Whole Foods people to read and hopefully teach them what I've learned over 42 years of running the company.
Thanks for that. And maybe just starting to delve a bit into your journey around being a conscious leader. You talk in the book about how a period of crisis led to this realization or awakening that you needed to be a more conscious leader. Can you share a little bit more about that time?
Well, crisis is a great opportunity to learn and grow. It's one of the best opportunities that we have in life. We actually start the book off with an introduction where I tell a story back in the year 2000, 2001, right around that time, when we went through a crisis. I personally went through a crisis because I had a coup. I had one of my senior executives plus a couple of directors were trying to basically get me fired and have the other executive take over as CEO. And I had to fight really hard to hang on to my job. And that resulted, that crisis helped me get back in touch with my own higher purpose. I realized one day touring stores right before I was going to meet with the board of directors that I just felt so connected to the team members, so connected to the customers. I realized, oh my God, I can't lose this. This is the purpose of my life. This is why I'm here. This is what I'm doing. And I don't want to lose this. And fortunately, I didn't lose it, but I almost did. I had a near-death experience, you might say. And from that near-death experience, I realized I had to grow as a human being and as a leader. I had to become, I had to be the change that I wished to see in the world. And I needed to take I needed a different relationship with the board of directors, since they had rallied by me, but two of those directors had to eventually resign from the board. I had to create more trust with my senior leadership team, and I had to become a more caring, loving person. I did a lot of deep work at that time. I did a lot of deep meditation. I did journaling. I did a process called holotropic breath work, which is a very powerful technique of connected breathing that allowed me to get deep into my own soul and my own being. And I really got grounded back into who I was, what I cared about. And I was challenged to just become a better human being and a better leader, and to become more conscious. And that was really when I first awakened to the importance of being a more conscious leader. And that's 20 years ago. So I'm a very different human being today than I was 20 years ago. And I've continued to learn and grow. I'm a better leader today than I was 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I was better than I was 15 years ago. But I do think that crisis that occurred was a real catalyst for my own desire to learn and grow as a leader. So crisis, they can either, as I say that sometimes when a crisis occurs, the natural human reaction is to contract, to go back and find a safe place where you won't be frightened anymore. And that usually means regression. That's exactly the worst strategy you can do. The crisis is an opportunity to do the opposite, which is to expand, open wider. The universe is banging you on the head, trying to get you to wake up and pay attention and show you something. And if you will open to it, you have a great opportunity to grow. If you contract back into fear and safety, you're missing the point. You won't grow, and you'll probably won't learn the lessons, and you'll end up failing. So crisis is good in the sense that it gives you a chance to grow, while it's extremely painful while you're going through it.
You, in the book, you refer to sort of being intentional, having that intentional journey of development. And it's not always easy to be intentional, just given the busyness of life. It's easy for those good intentions to fall by the wayside. You mentioned a few of your own personal practices for sort of keeping that intentionality front of mind. Can you just talk a little bit about more some of the things that you have done over the years or perhaps currently do to kind of keep thinking consciously about your leadership practices?
I mean, I suppose that some of the things that I do, first, kind of on a spiritual level, I do meditate. I do meditate. I won't say I meditate every day, but I meditate most days. I have a inner practice that I do in affirmations and visualizations and quieting the mind. I also practice sort of a mindful meditation. I do that earlier practice in the morning, and then mindful meditation is just simply being conscious in the moment, what you're doing. We tend to get lost in our thoughts. We tend to get lost in our mind chatter. And being present in the moment is mindfulness. So I do try to practice that every day as I go about the day, and that helps remind me. I also am a fanatical reader. I mean, I read probably as much or more than anybody I know, and I've read hundreds of business books. But I read philosophy, spirituality, anthropology, literature, fiction. Anything that I'm interested in, and economics, whatever helps me learn and grow. I believe that you can learn and grow all your life, and one of the best ways to do it is to challenge your mind to go places it hadn't gone before, and with thoughts and ideas that you've never thought about before. Ideas excite me, so when I get new ideas from books, they can change you, and I take them seriously and follow that wherever it leads. But the best way to learn and grow, the best practice you can have, without a question, is the most important thing is relationships. Trust me, I've learned more being married in 30 years than anything else. And my wife has taught me so much. My friends and family have taught me so much. Your friends are the ones that will tell you when you're full of shit. They're the ones that will tell you when your ego is out of control, if your wife hasn't already done it or your spouse hasn't already done it. So, I mean, I think those are the most important things in the world. Relationships, the most important thing in the world. If you have children, your children are going to be teachers too. Because for one thing, children will tell you how they see it. They're not so diplomatic. They'll tell you when they think you're being a jerk. So friends, family, relationships of all kinds, they give us a great opportunity to grow if we will pay attention. And maybe that's the common denominator between meditation, relationships, mindfulness, is simply attention, paying attention to what's going on, listening to people, really being present. You can learn and grow if you will just pay attention to it and not go off on your own narcissistic ego trip, which is what most people are doing most of the time.
There are several points throughout the book in which you credit purpose as something that's inspired by and propelled by other people. Who are the leaders that you look to for inspiration?
Who are the heroes, my heroes that have affected me the most? It's a good question. And I mean, the person that affected me the most was my father. I mean, my dad was my mentor. Obviously, when I was a kid, he was my mentor. But in business, from age 24 in 1978 until 1994, I never made a big business decision without checking with my dad first. And that was a really smart thing to do because my dad was older, wiser, experienced in business, and I wasn't. I didn't have a business background. I studied philosophy and religion in school and anthropology and sociology and psychology. So I just didn't have that background for business. My dad did. And I always say I would have driven the Whole Foods bus off a cliff many times if my dad hadn't been there to say, you should slow down. Let's take a right turn up here. And so he was my first and greatest teacher. But there have been many historical people that have inspired me. And we live in kind of a woke time, so it's careful whenever you say your heroes, and none of these are perfect individuals, so everybody can be criticized. But I'm a student of American history. I'm very inspired by the early founders of our republic: George Washington, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Thomas Paine. These were all amazing individuals that all inspired me. I think they founded a country, and so anybody that's creating a new business, in a sense, is creating their own little country, their own little universe, and so a lot of the things that drove those founders, I think, also of our country, also drive founders of enterprises, and then other historical figures: Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Mandela. Those were all incredibly inspiring to me. Henry David Thoreau was an inspiration. And more contemporary business people, I know that, again, this will be, and people will wonder about this, but I found a lot of the business giants of the 19th century to be very inspiring, even if they weren't particularly conscious leaders. People like Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, Andrew Mellon, Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Edison, Tesla. These guys were these were all geniuses, and they created tremendous enterprises that and were very inspiring to me. And more current leaders: Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates. These are all people that inspired me. And more recently, Elon Musk is obviously so. Entrepreneurs inspire me. Reed Hastings at Netflix inspires me. So there's lots of people. I've learned from a lot of people.
I'm going to pivot a little. I'm going to come back to a different question, but just it sounds a bit like, the leaders that you cite are those who really did catalyze change in the spaces where they occupy. They, as you said, they were entrepreneurs or creators, and they intrinsically were people who created value. And that's one of the sort of characteristics that you cite in the book as a sort of obvious role of the leader is to create value. And so I'm just curious, as I reflect on my experience working together with many people across Whole Foods, one of the memories or sort of characteristics that has stood out to me is that kind of observing value creation as it happens in the regions. So those, your regional teams have a lot of independence to test ideas in their stores. If they're successful, those are kind of quickly adopted across other regions. There's a really good environment for that experimentation, and likewise friendly competition that you all kind of catalyze within the company. So I'm curious, how did that environment of experimentation and competition, obviously towards the goal of value creation, get started at Whole Foods?
I think it got started primarily because the way Whole Foods grew. So we started out in Austin, and then we went to Houston, but after we went public, in particular, Whole Foods began to acquire companies that were similar to ours, that were in different geographical regions. So, for example, we acquired Bread and Circus in Boston, and that became the place that we grew from in the New England area. And so Bread and Circus had their own culture. They had their own way of doing things. It was different than Whole Foods. And we were humble enough to realize they were doing some things better than Whole Foods was doing. And there were things we were doing better than them. And so we allowed them to continue to innovate in their own unique ways while putting the DNA of Whole Foods into Bread and Circus. And then Mrs. Gooch's in Los Angeles, that became another platform for us to be able to grow from. Fresh Fields, based in Washington and also simultaneously in Chicago, where we were opening stores. In Philadelphia, they became another platform for us to grow in the Mid-Atlantic regions. In Florida, we acquired Unicorn Village and Bread of Life, and those two stores became the foundation for our Florida expansion. So when we made those acquisitions, they were being independently managed, and we linked them back together. But that allowed all of these different regions to be partly doing their own thing, partly innovating and creating, and then was best practices. It's like, what's working in Bread and Circus that we could copy and do everywhere, and what's working well in Mrs. Gooch's. And then eventually we changed all the names to Whole Foods Market. To give I remember one time reading, it's like somebody was criticizing Whole Foods, and they said, it's too bad they can't do it as well as Bread and Circus and Fresh Fields do it. What we need is a Fresh Fields or a Bread and Circus to come open here. And it was like, hey, we are Fresh Fields, we are Bread and Circus, we are Mrs. Gooch's. So we needed to get our brand identity synced up. So, but it was by setting up those different platforms in different parts of the country that allowed us to innovate on a regional basis and then take the successful innovations and spread them. That's really one of the secrets to our success.
Another piece maybe related to that is, and you talk about this in the book, is the importance, and this is kind of coming a bit to purpose, but you talk about having purpose champions, having people throughout the organization who kind of champion what you stand for. And I would have to imagine, given the history that you just described, where Whole Foods came together over time via both organic growth, but also acquisition, that it was important for you to ensure that there was that common thread of purpose throughout the company, the many companies that came together, the distributed regional nature of that. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you think about purpose champions inside of Whole Foods.
One thing about purpose is that it's part of the culture now at Whole Foods, so it partly self-perpetuates itself. On the other hand, Whole Foods continue to grow pretty rapidly. So even though we've got amazing seniority in our organization, every year, probably another tens of thousands of new people are just begin working in Whole Foods that never worked here before. And although the culture influences them unconsciously, if part of being a conscious leader is recognizing that if you don't continue to renew your purpose, it'll fade. People will forget about it. And that happens to most corporations, by the way. The purpose is something they put on their wall someplace, but it's not living. It's not something they experience in their day-to-day lives. And so Whole Foods works against that. We now have cultural champions. And part of being a cultural champion is you have to get certified to be a cultural champion, and understanding our purpose is part of that. Purpose is something that needs to be in your orientation, but more importantly, it has to be something the leadership talks about all the time. I'm constantly, it's rare that I have a town hall meeting or I'm talking to team members where I don't mention the purpose and talk about it and why it's important and connect it back to their day-to-day work. Because purpose, it needs to be living. It needs to not just be something that people, it's somewhere buried in the history of the company. So you got to make it alive, and it's important that you have people in the company that are purpose champions that are holding the organization accountable for what it says. It's like, if this is our higher purpose, are we doing that right now? Are we doing something that's counter to that? Well, if you are, then either you should change your purpose or you should stop doing it. So I think purpose and cultures and values are what hold an organization together. And I might add leadership principles. One of the great learnings that we've had from Amazon is the importance of leadership principles, because they combine with core values and purpose. That's really sort of the glue that holds the organization together. It helps unite people from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different geographical regions. Those can all connect people together, and it's how the organization continues to be effective in the world.
You just mentioned what is probably not an uncommon occurrence of when you're needing to make a decision and someone needs to be saying, hey, are we being true to our purpose? How do you think about balancing, the underlying purpose of Whole Foods with, as you discuss in the book, sort of the pragmatic objectives of the business, delivering business results? How do you sort of seek to put both of those in balance?
That's a good question, and that's part of the art of leadership. You've got to do both simultaneously. You've got to come up with strategies where you can fulfill your higher purpose and be successful doing it. And if you have strategies that aren't doing both, they're maybe not the best strategies, and you need to rethink them. So, but sometimes you get off track. It's inevitable. I mean, in the day-to-day hubbub of the world, and purposes do evolve over time. I mean, I think if you're going to have a really conscious purpose, you're also re-examining it all the time. Is this still our higher purpose, or is our purpose subtly changing and evolving? And if so, is it time to make that changing purpose more conscious? So, I think Google's purpose is different than it was 20 years ago. And maybe Amazon's purpose is as well. I won't speak for Amazon. Whole Foods' purpose is still pretty much the same as it was, but it's bigger now. So when we say nourish people on the planet, we have a much deeper meaning of what people on the planet means, and what nourish means. Because there's lots of ways to nourish. You nourish with food, but you also nourish with love. You nourish with philanthropy and care, and there's lots of ways to magnify your impact so that it's nourishing.
That's a good segue to what I also wanted to get into. Is you have a whole section in the book where you talk about love, leading with love, which is probably a pretty unconventional topic to have inside a book on business. I'm curious how you came to utilize that metaphor. And you discuss other metaphors in the book around kind of approaches to business. But how did you land on love as a metaphor for your conscious leadership?
I do think love is mostly held in the corporate closet of most corporations because of the metaphors people use, which are war metaphors, sports metaphors, Darwinian metaphors, or technology metaphors. And they all, none of those have a place for love. So, if you think about it, what's more important than love? I mean, when we get to the end of our lives, it's going to be about our relationships. It's going to be about, that's what matters. What matters in life primarily are relationships, and our significant other, our parents, our children, our other family members, our friends, our colleagues at work, the people that we're sharing our adventure, our life adventure with. That's what matters. That's like the most important thing in life. And love is what holds that together. And it's just a shame not to have love, to have it bottled up and not allow that to express itself in our corporations. It's what needs to most happen is to let love loose, because love is what connects people together. I mean, I think it is loose at Whole Foods. COVID's challenged it, but still love is still very, very common at Whole Foods. And that's why people don't turn over at Whole Foods. People work for our company a long, long time. It's one of the first things that I think Amazonians noticed about Whole Foods people is how long you've been here. Not that long, only 12 years. I mean, well, I 25 years, 30 years, 35 years. I mean, why do they stay? They stay because of love. They stay because they have a connection with, this is their family, this is their tribe, this is where they feel at home, and because they're loved in return. Love is what is the glue that holds an organization together. And to not unleash love really holds the highest potential of a corporation back, in my opinion. So, because that's what life's about. It's people ask me, what's the purpose of life? Love. Love is the purpose of life. Love, to awaken to love. It needs to be awakened in all our organizations. Good God, does it need to be alive in America right now? I mean, I see so much hate. I see so much judgment, so much attacks. And I'm thinking, where's the love? I mean, why is love so scarce right now in America? So that's my favorite chapter in the book. I spend a lot of time on that chapter personally. Lead with love. I wish some of our political leaders were leading with love, and I don't see it very. We need it everywhere in our corporations, but we also need it in politics, in our schools, and our military.
Absolutely. And in that chapter, you talk about sort of three manifestations of love. You talk about gratitude, generosity, and appreciations. And as you mentioned earlier, one of my earliest experiences with Whole Foods was a big set of meetings that we had in Seattle at the beginning of our integration journey together. And we concluded that meeting with a round of appreciations, which was definitely a sort of a foreign cultural experience to be a part of that time, and many times forward. Of course, it became more sort of natural and normal with time. But I'd love to hear you explain and share more with folks about what appreciations are and maybe how they got started inside Whole Foods.
Sure. So just as background, so in the chapter on leading with love, we do identify love as a complex thing. It's not just, there are many attributes to it, and you named a few of them, but there, gratitude, generosity, appreciation. There's also care, there's compassion, and there's forgiveness. And those are all important aspects of love that need to be practiced. Love is a skill. We can become more skillful at loving if we practice it. It's not just a feeling. It's a way of being in the world, and a way of showing up every day in our lives. So appreciations are one magical way an organization can release love. And so often we spend our time, and what Whole Foods does is we end our meetings with appreciations, as you mentioned. And they're voluntary, nobody has to do it. But what we found is when you authentically appreciate, you cannot authentically appreciate somebody without opening your heart. And when you open your heart, you're actually opening to love, because that's what opening your heart means. And it's very difficult to continue to judge and dislike somebody who's authentically appreciating you with love. It's like you begin to rethink it. It's like, I think maybe I misjudged Mary. Mary's, got a lot of wonderful traits and qualities I hadn't focused on before. And the human beings have reciprocity, such an important part of our nature, that when somebody is loving us and appreciating us, we want to love them back. And so appreciations has this important magnifying effect. And oftentimes in meetings, long meetings that, happen a lot in corporations, particularly in this COVID time, I feel like I just go from one Chime meeting to the next Chime meeting, the occasional Zoom meeting thrown in for good measure. They're outside the company. And appreciations are easy to do. So I would say, I sometimes say when I'm doing a talk on conscious capitalism or conscious leadership, I say, look, if you get nothing else out of this lecture, if you just go and start trying to practice appreciations, you'll get what I'm talking about. Because I would say at Whole Foods, we introduce appreciations, and we still do it all the time at Whole Foods, and you've had a taste of it. The last domino to fall at Whole Foods was my board of directors. It took about 10 years before I could get the board to actually do appreciations. And they liked them so much after that, I never could get any board members to ever want to leave, because they loved the board meetings so much, partly because of the appreciations. It's very powerful, and that's a good sort of 101 for creating more love in your team and your organization. At Whole Foods, in our senior leadership team, for example, we have to limit appreciations. We used to have unlimited, and sometimes appreciations would go on for 2 hours. It's like, okay, you can only appreciate 3 people. But lately we've cut it down. You pick one person to appreciate, and that way appreciations, you can get through them in 10 or 15 minutes instead of a couple hours.
I have certainly experienced that firsthand. I can provide testimony to the length of time with which they can go on, which is a pretty cool experience to be a part of. I have a lot more questions to ask you, but I know we're probably short on time. And so I might seek to wrap up with a quote that you bring in the book from Maya Angelou, which I found to be super powerful. And that quote is, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I found that particularly resonant with how Whole Foods thinks about kind of the value and investment that you place in your broad team member base. And so I'd love maybe just to end on how this sort of focus on team member happiness became sort of at the origin of Whole Foods' core values, and maybe what you do to continue to cultivate that today.
It could be because we're in physical retail. We've figured out that the customer is your most important stakeholder. And, one of the ways we really sync up well with Amazon is Amazon's commitment to being the world's most customer-centric organization or company. But here's the thing. You take care of customers through your team members. And if the team members are unhappy, they're not going to give very good service. And it's an end in itself to have team member happiness, but you have to realize that it's also a means to another end, which is customer happiness. I sometimes say physical retail is kind of simple in a way. You just hire the best people you can find, make sure they're well trained, and then management's job is to keep them happy. Because if they're happy, they're going to make the customers happy. The customers are happy, they're going to give you repeat business. They're going to be your best advertising and marketing you ever have. And that's going to result in the business flourishing, which makes the investors happy. And then you get this virtuous circle, or you have a flywheel of happy team members, happy customers, happy investors, happy team members, happy customers. And by the way, throw the suppliers in there because you're no better than your suppliers. So happy suppliers results in better products, better service, et cetera, et cetera. And so part of what conscious business is and conscious leadership is recognizing the interdependency of these major stakeholders and trying to do all you can to make each one of them satisfied and happy. But for Whole Foods, the secret to our success is we genuinely care about our team members. We love our team members, and they know it because we show it to them in so many different ways. And COVID has challenged that, by the way. I mean, I sometimes feel like we're making everybody mask up. They're not able to connect. They have to social distance. We're making cultural withdrawals every day now. But we've made deposits for so long that the bank isn't yet emptied out. But we can't do this indefinitely. We've got to take the mask off. We've got to let people hug each other again. And we got to sort of normalize our lives again. And I do believe that will happen over the next year. And Whole Foods will be able to we try to love our team members as best we can during this crisis. And truthfully, Amazon's been very supportive of that by helping us pay better, by giving people bonuses, by giving unlimited time off call outs. And so Amazon's been a tremendous partner for Whole Foods during the whole COVID crisis. Tremendous. And my admiration for the company's gone up a couple notches, which is already really high. But it's about the team members of Whole Foods. It's about loving them and caring for them. And we did. And it's part of our culture. And hopefully that's going to long outlive me with the company.
Thank you for sharing all of that, John. Lots, obviously, in the book that we didn't get a chance to discuss. So obviously encourage all of the listeners to check out your book, which is released on September 15th. Congratulations on that. And it will be available at local bookstores and, of course, on Amazon. So I'm sure many folks
Heather,
will be looking forward to reading it.
We did talk about the book because everything we talked about is what the book's based on. So if you like to talk, then go to the book. And if you didn't like it, probably don't bother.
There'll just be much more to delve into along these lines. All right. Thanks again, John. Take care.
Thanks, Heather. You take care too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.